Hello, and welcome back to episode 5 of our Out of the Abyss recap series of videos. I'm your Dungeon Master, David, and where we last left off, the party had not been doing the best. They had lost the Bard Roscoe after an encounter with the Demon Lord Gratz, and they had made their way to Lady Saria Darialis, the Bloodstained Calamity, an elder vampire trapped in the confines of her tower in the Underdark due to the fact that with the emergence of the Demon Lords, the Demon Lord Orcus, who is one of the greatest rulers of undeath in the multiverse, would have the ability to subjugate her should she leave the wards of her tower. Now, when you're a vampire, you're already a little restricted in the things that you can do, and of course, being unable to leave your home is even more restraining, which I had made when the campaign started near the end of the first year of COVID because of the mindset that we had all been going through. So as the party finishes their long rest, they discover that during the night, Saria has had her pet purple worm carve a tunnel to Blingvian Stone's borders. I did this for two reasons in the actual campaign. First, due to the tunnelless nature of the Underdark, especially given the trek that they had had from Sloopledoop to the Neverlight Grove, I felt like it would be better to give a literal straight line and make sure that the party had a tangible goal in mind. And this would help them get to the surface and maybe go get an army, which was their plan. However, what I couldn't change was the fact that it's a 14-day trip in game time, so it was going to be a long trek ahead of them. But my party and my players, they were very much doing okay for the most part. Laughter was ingratiating himself into the party and quickly becoming accepted, which is something you always want to see when a player needs to bring in a new player character. And it definitely set a track for his, well, I don't want to say worth, but his overall addition to the party. With 14 days, however, there were quite a bit of encounters along the way, starting with the first encounter, which was something that I rolled rather rare, which was an elemental planal node. Now, there are, in the D&D Pantheon, a huge, almost interconnected web of planes, and the outer planes, such as the Abyss and Mount Celestia and the Nine Hells, are all quite distant, but interconnected to the prime material are the four elemental planes. The first of which that I encountered as a player is the one that I love the most, which is the elemental plane of water. I've always found myself attracted to water. Just as an element, I find it both gentle and powerful. And you can also see it in the way that the elemental plane of water is described in the Dungeon Master's Guide. It is a paradise in certain parts of the entire ocean that the plane encompasses, and in other aspects it is an abyss, almost like a heterophagic zone, that is very reminiscent of a section of one of my favorite mods, the Terraria Calamity mod, and the Abyss in there. The Abyss has had a very sort of all-encompassing effect in my life, so to speak. But though they didn't decide to go into the plane, which would have been a good idea, as Laughter is, due to his upbringing in the elemental plane of fire, he is fundamentally opposed to the elemental plane of water. But they did manage to put a fishing line in, and they got some magic items in. However, as they did, they also got encountered with some ropers in disguise. Now, ropers are a very dangerous kind of creature, especially in the Underdark, given the fact that when ropers are attacking, they have multiple tendrils that can grapple and restrain, and they also have a bite that does some pretty serious damage. And given their sort of camouflaged kind of nature, party members typically get ambushed quite a bit. It's a very hard passive perception check to even see a roper in its disguise. But despite some combat, the party absolutely managed to find its way to get knocked out of the roper's tendrils, and they managed to fork up some beautiful sapphires from the elemental plane of water, as well as a elemental gem of summoning, which had they used it, which I don't believe they ever did in the duration of the campaign, if they had ever done that, it would have been interesting, especially given the fact that Laughter kind of started to mold himself into a summoner's position. But it was, for the most part, after the Lamia fight, it was a much-needed reprise. But afterwards, we had some various more encounters in the Underdark. As they continued on, the ropers were kind of a pushover because Mallos had AoE attacks, which is the one sort of answer you have to ropers. And over the next few days, the party managed to settle down into some more sort of relaxing environments. They encountered their go-to merchant for the campaign, the Tabaxi Sassafras. And Sassafras had a couple of items for sale. I always kind of tried to roll random when it was just him, and I believe what they had at the time was yes, according to one of my players' notes, he had a Cloak of Elvenkind, he had a Ring of Animal Influence, he had a very rare Cloak of the Arachnid, and he also had a Giant Potion for their cells. This was coming off the cusp of Azrael, who during the Night's Watch after the encounter with the ropers, he was brought into contact with Gratz, and given the fact that Azrael was one of the only members who tried to talk his way out of the Gratz encounter, Gratz made him a deal, which Azrael then refused. Sorry for the ambient sounds. And after he refused, Gratz used the effect of the dream spell to make it so that Azrael did not get a benefit of a long rest. Now, the dream spell is a very fun niche spell, but it's also one of those spells that you always want to be careful reminding people exist, because it is sort of the perfect weapon to hand a dungeon master if you just don't want to give your players long rests. That's how you get a Russian sleep experiment, so to speak. But yeah, and after encountering Sassafras, there were also a couple of encounters, one of which was the encounter of a Temple of Azuth. It was sort of of the main deities who are in the PHB, Azuth has always sounded pretty awesome, because he kind of sounds like, if Merlin had ascended. And that was definitely one of the greatest aspects of just interweaving the various deities from the PHB into the story, if I could. Ayun worked her way into there, Bahamut worked his way into there, among some other ones. And at the temple, there was a sphinx, and aside from the players didn't fight the sphinx. It was just sort of a, this is neat, and then decided to keep walking kind of moment, which happens a lot in certain combat days when the party just decides they don't want to do that much. Until a very fun encounter where after seeing a light in the distance, the party members, I think it was Ellie, the rogue initially, that Cameron initially played, Ellie managed to find herself encountering one of nature's most horrifying monsters. So, I have very little, in all honesty, experience with the Final Fantasy franchise. I've played the entirety of 10, and even then I couldn't tell you a whole lot about it because that was during COVID and the memory's kind of hazy at this point. And it just wasn't that interesting of a story. I played about half of 10-2, which was interesting for a bit, but then I fell off of it. I played about half of 13 and then got bored because 13 was kind of not very good. And I played about a fourth of Crystal Chronicles. So that'll tell you just how much experience I have with the Final Fantasy franchise. But at the same time, I always do like reading into Final Fantasy, and my favorite creature from that is definitely Tonberries. Just the idea of this tiny little green lizard being who has the ability to deal more damage to you with the more blood that's on your hands is actually one of the inspirations that comes from the genocide run in Undertale when you're fighting Sans, how his method of combat is called karma. So I've always correlated Tonberries with Sanses. And they're just really cute, but also super deadly. I created a stat block for this creature, and after it stabbed the shit out of Ellie, the rest of the party managed to recover and get the fuck out of there. And Tonberries aren't super fast, and they have other places to go wander off to. So they managed to get by it for the most part, which was probably for the best. If they had killed it, they would have gotten, at minimum, a legendary magic item, but killing it would have also been a very hard thing to do in the first place. It's kind of designed like a super version of the Reaper card from the Deck of Many Things. But as they continued along, they also found themselves in the ploy of Gratz, as he doesn't take rejection very well. And one of the things that he decided to do was try and bring a creature to them who tried to fib his way through some deception checks, asking for Roscoe's body. Now, what he was going to do with Roscoe's body, well, that will have to come at a later episode. But at the same time, he managed to briefly at least get the party talking before revealing himself to be a Death Slod. A very powerful creature, one that the party managed to thankfully take care of, but at the same time, Death Slods are notorious for how hard they hit. And as the Death Slod reveals itself, it manages to find several ways to deal some damage until Azrael puts it down with his blade, Dawnbringer. Now, as the creature dies, Gratz takes control and laments the fact that he wasn't able to get through with his initial plan to fuckery, but he had several other plans. And this sort of was my attempt to continuously beat down the morale of the players as they continued in this treachery through the Underdark, as they had been down here for quite a while, and they had certainly taken some licks despite the strength that they were getting. At the same time, they continuously got various dream visits. They got dream visits from Ayun for Mallos. They got dream visits from Tasha for Criella. And they got dream visits from one of them, who we'll get into a little bit later. Also, during the 14 days of encounter, these lamos, and I say this with all the love in my heart for my players, avoided several fun encounters. So this was right around the time where I started to play the shit out of Monster Hunter Rise. As one of my friends would have said, or did say during that time in my life, I definitely did a deep dive. And I found a PDF of a lot of creatures that had them. So mostly Elder Dragons / big creatures such as Namael, Basilgeuse, and Chameleos. And unfortunately, one of my players had played as much of Monster Hunter as I had, if not more, probably more. And that meant that he knew exactly what it was, and he wanted to avoid those encounters. And since he was one of the cool-headed, level-headed members of the party, they followed his advice without a hitch. And that was quite a disappointment from my end. But at the same time, it's just, you know, one of those things that's going to happen, I suppose. You know, you have to give as many adventuring hooks to your party members as you can, and hopefully they'll trigger some of them, and those triggers won't always lead to things like a TPK or whatnot. But after various days of traveling, the party, after a certain point, has a encounter with Lolth herself. Now, Lolth was always sort of a weird aspect for me to bring into the story, because she is the driving force in the events, but a lot of the stuff with the Drow in the printed Out of the Abyss book is only kind of interesting to me. So I wanted to really make sure that I did it sort of correctly. The entire time that they had been in the Underdark, the Drow had been pursuing them. So as the party continued on, they found themselves encountering Lolth's avatar. And she spoke very bluntly, which was essentially telling them to just go to the surface and walk away, and if they did, she would promise that the Drow would stop pursuing. And from a dungeon master perspective, now that the campaign is over, she had every intention of fulfilling this. But at the same time, the party kind of knew better than to trust her. And some shenanigans began as she started sending spiders to sort of watch them as they made their way towards what Lolth thought was their way out. Now the party got very suspicious of these spiders as they were following, but at the same time, she had every intention of just observing. although she was sending more and more spiders, which got the party more and more riled up until something happened. But before that something happened, there was an instance where there was a dream visitor for Brack of all people, which was kind of new. Brack kind of found himself in a imagination with a being known as Fraz. And when Fraz started to talk to Brack, and Fraz introduced himself as a little sort of gargoyle kind of creature, this was mostly to set up for when they were to go back into the Underdark, and he kind of, an eye through him gave Brack specifically a lot more breadcrumbs to follow once they were to go back into the Underdark. Hopefully, if they would, because they never. Once you get out of the Abyss, there's no reason for your first player characters to go back in. It's actually one of the few written stories where if you want to go in with a new party, like a seasoned group of adventurer who feel like they're hot shit, you can absolutely do that. And so it was pretty interesting. But unfortunately, after Brack woke up and the being called Fraz sort of erased all memories of this happening, too many spiders started to show up. And as they did, Lolth got pissed, and she, in her avatar state, transformed to try and attack them. And she was using the stat block of, again, another Monster Hunter creature, specifically called Araktakadaki. And I might be mispronouncing that. But, unfortunately, my player Chase, bless his heart, decided, hey, I cast Banishment. And it worked. And I should have given a legendary resistance, but I didn't. And because it wasn't from the native plane, because Lolth is still in the Abyss, it worked perfectly. But sometimes in D&D, it's the rule of cool above anything else that kind of trumps most of the other stuff. And as the party continued, thanks to the Tieflings' efforts, at this point they were super beaten down, and actually ran into their merchant friend yet again. And when he kind of got the rundown, they all managed to get what was essentially a one-way trip, not a one-way trip. They managed to get a exclusive trip to the actual interdimensional shop that Sassafras works for. Now, the shop itself is a place called Silurian Goods and Wares, and it's run by a basically 30th level forge cleric known as Zaldan Silurian. He was actually one of the first, if not the first, D&D characters I ever made. And he was the merchant for the entirety of another campaign that I had, and he's sort of my go-to merchant in every story. And he, after Sassafras brought the party to the main store, although Silurian Goods and Wares are sworn an oath to not interfere with most going-ons, just sell your goods to the highest bidder, whether that's Gold Dragon looking for some shit or Lord Strahd looking for some shit. It doesn't matter to Zaldan. But this is a rule I bend a lot, just for the sake of like, hey, he's still a person. And the party actually got a trip over to Blingdenstone, traveling in the store, which works sort of like Hal's Castle does, how it has various gateways to other locations. Each character also had a magic item made for them here. I will get into the exact specifics of those items in our next episode, because they require 6 slides onto themselves. But it was a well-welcomed reprieve for the players. Also due to the fact that I didn't have a whole party during those last few in-game days, because I believe our player Ashe was out for some of them. We got through the rest of the 14 days of travel, and the party managed to find their way into Blingdenstone. Now, Blingdenstone needs an episode unto itself, which I promised to get out sooner than last time. And the few things you need to know is that the City of the Deep Gnomes are plagued by ghosts and elementals and basilisks, and perhaps what some could call the god of slimes. But until then, have a good night, and don't be afraid of the dark.